Welcome to this week's episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. On this week's episode, we look into revisionist history and the peaceful Palestine filled with murder. Let's get started. I apologize to my listeners who maybe weren't expecting to hear from me so quickly. If you listened to our last episode, I talked about how I'm leaving to Israel on a mission to educate my listeners and future students and people all around the world about the incidents of the October 7th massacre in Israel. However, there is something that's been on my mind this past week, and I felt like I really needed to talk about it before I left. So I made sure to record this before leaving for Israel, and you're hearing it now when I'm probably on the way to Israel. Just as a quick reminder for anybody who follows this podcast, please follow us on jdr.podcast for more up-to-date current events going on while I'm in Israel and visiting these sites. There'll be photos and videos, even maybe audio recordings and things of that nature, so please feel free to follow along, be on the journey with me. Now that that's out of the way, I wanted to talk about today's topic, which is something that's been really on my mind as social media activists are getting really bold with the lies that they're telling online. And I don't want you guys to fall for this because it's a pretty easy talking point to sort of fall for if you don't know the history. And as is customary on this podcast, I want to bring you that history so you can be armed with the facts in order to fight back against these fake narratives. One that many of you have probably heard many times already, if not, you will definitely be hearing it over and over again, is this idea that Palestine was such a great place that the Arabs and the Jews and the Christians lived together in such harmony and beauty, and it was only when the Zionists and the 1948 state was established that the terrible things of the current conflict have started happening. So if you notice in this narrative, what they're doing is pretending that life was great, everyone got along, and it's only when the quote-unquote Zionists and the Jews showed up and then stole the state from the Palestinians, that's when things got bad. And that's only when the Arabs started to fight against the Jews and started killing people. If you notice, it's kind of taking away the responsibility from the Arabs murdering Jews and almost justifying it. Because life was great before you Jews who came from Europe and wherever, you got here and you started the problem. It's your fault we're murdering you in the streets. I have heard this so many times, and I've brought it up to people online who are in the comment sections talking about how life was so peaceful, and I simply bring up the facts and the reality. This past week, I had this crazy long argument with some guy who literally had no idea what he was talking about. It ended up devolving into ad hominem attacks and talking about silly things, and he would jump from place to place as they always do because he couldn't really justify. But the main point he tried to make, which I completely debunked, was life was so great before 1948. The land was peaceful. And so let's just see how peaceful the land was. The Jews and the Arabs and the Christians who all lived in the land in various places, various times, various demographic changes based on the Christians conquering, the Muslims conquering, the Jews being murdered essentially by both of them, and so on and so on. All three lived at one point together. But were they living in harmony? A simple Google search, which most of these people will not do because, of course, why bother when you have talking points? A simple Google search will prove that there were many incidents of violence in the land long before 1948, long before the country was even a country. While they were still under British rule and Ottoman rule before that, there wasn't really a whole bunch of peace going on, despite what they say. This is not an exhaustive list. This is a very brief few points that I'll bring up just to show how inaccurate this was. In the 1920s, we had the Battle of Tel Hai in northern Israel. The Arabs started a war that ended up killing 8 Jews. 5 Arabs were killed. In 1921, the very well-known Jaffa riots that lasted 7 days killed 48 Arabs, 47 Jews, and 147 Jews were wounded. This is a fight between Jewish groups and Arab groups in Jaffa. Very peaceful from the sounds of it. A number of years later, in 1929, the Arabs started yet another riot, killing 133 Jews, 116 Arabs killed, and 339 Jews wounded. This included the very famous Hebron massacre, where essentially the Arabs went door to door murdering Jews in Hebron. That was until the British forcefully removed the Jews from Hebron, one of their holiest sites, in order to quash the violence. The list continues. In 1933, there were multiple riots, another one in Jaffa, one in Haifa. In 1936, there was another Jaffa riot between Arabs and Jews. This time, 9 Jews were killed and 40 wounded. And this goes on and on up until the 1940s. Obviously, I'm not going to go through the entire list, but clearly you can see here these were not minor incidents. These were repeated incidents. Jaffa had multiple angry Arab riots killing Jews. So the idea that this land was so peaceful before the quote-unquote Zionists showed up, or if they blame the violence today on the occupation, which they commonly use, there was no occupation when the British were occupying everybody equally. In fact, actually, they were occupying the Jews worse because they wouldn't allow Jews to enter the land and would forcibly remove Jews from areas that these riots were taking place in. The levels in which these people will essentially ignore all history to keep their point somewhat accurate, like pretending this is all a problem with Zionism and the state of Israel being declared, nothing had happened before, everything was peaceful until the Zionists showed up, which could not be further from the truth, because the reality was the Arabs and the Jews weren't peaceful. The Arabs wanted the Jews out from the moment the British took over. There's also no question that one of the first leadership of the quote-unquote Palestinian Arabs, remember, they actually didn't see themselves as Palestinian Arabs. They called themselves South Syrian Arabs because they knew that according to all documentation, the Palestinians were actually the Jewish people of the land, not the Arabs. They saw themselves as a unified Arab state with Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, all countries that didn't exist yet. They were all one people. The man who led this, not even really a unique group of people, they didn't see themselves as unique, was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who was actually put in by the British. This was a man, one of 2 candidates that the British decided to make the unofficial leader or spokesperson of the Palestinian Arabs, as they would have seen it. And much to the dismay of the British, who put him there because they assumed that he was a somewhat secular, somewhat open and willing to work with the British kind of person, which is how he portrayed himself, he actually was a rabid anti-Jewish person, so much so that not only did he stoke the problems of the Palestinian Arabs in order to create all of the riots that you just heard, but he also was in very close touch and lived with the Germans in Berlin. The reason being because he was hoping that once Germany finished the Jewish problem in Europe, they would happily come down and kill all the Jews of what then was known as British Mandate of Palestine. Clearly, this is not a man who is in search for peace and coexistence and working together with their Jewish neighbors. This is someone who planned and hoped for the death of Jews in order to remove them from the land. So what do we do with this talking point that they keep using? This, it was peaceful until the Zionists showed up. No matter how much I tried to tell this person online to take a look at any of these facts, very, very clear. This is historical, no slants. Clearly, it was not peaceful. When you have riots, wars, death, killing, murder, that is not peaceful, no matter who starts it. So why they keep saying that it's peaceful is a way, again, to make sure that they remove the blame off of themselves. This is the absolute key to their revisionist history. Not only do they make up the story that there was a Palestine, which, by the way, for the record, no one has ever shown me in my history of education one single Palestinian leader before 1948. There was no president, prime minister, king, no leader at all. They also didn't have any borders that they can point to. I pointed out recently on Instagram how convenient and coincidental that when the League of Nations in the 1920s created a map of what is now known as Israel, including all of the territories, and the map of what is now known as Jordan, that the map of Israel apparently matches perfectly with this ancient country of Palestine. Isn't that a heck of a coincidence? The League of Nations happened to find the ancestral borders of a Palestinian nation, or maybe the Palestinians in 1960 took that map from the 1920s claiming that's Palestine. It's just obviously a very big coincidence that the claim of Palestinian land doesn't accidentally go into Jordan and take any of their land, just the Jewish state. We just needed the Jewish land. Inch by inch, the exact same land the Jews were going to get, that was our state. That existed, apparently. But this is all just essentially revisionist history. They are making things up. This was not a peaceful place that was owned by Palestinians, that had a Palestinian leadership that the Jews stole, and the Jews then occupied and put people into camps and killed people and expelled people. All of these riots that I had mentioned happened long before any of that. And this is not the only place that these people are using revisionist history. I am actually shocked at how far this talking point is going. This is a new talking point that's come up, but it has gone across the world and back. It is absolutely unbelievable. And I'm sure you've probably heard of it before. It's called the Hanibal Directive. We have even seen mainstream media catching on to this Hanibal Directive in hopes to use it as a weapon against the Israelis. And you're going to see how this ties into the first revisionist history that we just talked about. In the case with the first revisionist history, we saw how technically they are trying to remove the blame off of the Arab people for murdering Jews. And then in this case, which I'll explain what the Hanibal Directive is in a second if you don't already know, is again taking the blame off of the Arabs for killing Jews, the exact same playbook. So now let's get to what the Hanibal Directive is. The Hanibal Directive is something that the IDF created. This was in the 1980s in a way to fight back against a tactic that was being used in Lebanon during the Lebanese War, and something that the Israelis were incredibly scared of. At this point in time, during the Lebanese War, it was becoming more and more apparent to the Israelis that the people who were fighting against Israel and the terrorist groups, the Palestinians who were in Lebanon, for example, these people were using the tactic of kidnapping soldiers and civilians to use as human shields and as bargaining chips. And in the event that they are captured, they were known to be tortured and more often killed as a punishment against the state of Israel. As we can see today, there really isn't that much difference between what Hamas is doing and what the PLO and the terrorists of Palestine in Lebanon were doing in the 80s, kidnapping people, killing, torturing, and now even raping them. So in response to this very obvious fact that everyone knew, Israel created the Hanibal Directive. This was an IDF protocol that said, essentially, if someone is being taken and kidnapped and put into custody by a terrorist organization, then instead of just backing off and allowing it to happen and dealing with negotiations and trying to get people back, the Israelis could not rely on having a Palestinian negotiation or a Lebanese Hezbollah negotiation or a Hamas negotiation responsible for getting that person back. And we could see that in action today, ironically. So instead of hanging back and hoping that these terrorists are going to abide by the Geneva Convention and all the rules of war, that you have to treat prisoners of war safely and well and make sure not to harm them and you can't use sexual violence against them, we all know that that is out the window. So Israel's Hanibal Directive essentially says that at all costs, the Israeli army is not meant to stand back and allow it to happen. They need to risk their own lives, no matter what, and even, unfortunately, the lives of the people who are being taken as captives in hopes to get those people back. It seems somewhat obvious here. You don't want someone to be taken into custody to be raped, murdered, and tortured, so you do everything you can to get them back. Kind of common sense, you would think. Unfortunately, this is not how it's being told to you and other people in the media. They are presenting the Hanibal Directive as the intentional mass murder of Israeli citizens for no reason other than because there happens to be a terrorist attack. And rather than allowing all of these innocent women, children, babies, whatever, get kidnapped, they just went scorched earth on the Israelis and just opened fire, supposedly, according to them, with Apache helicopters, and they came in with machine guns and tanks and just killed everybody who was Israeli in hopes that they won't be taken as hostages, which is absolutely insane when you think about it. But I guess when you think that Israel is insane and does crazy things, it makes total sense to you that they would murder their own people. It would take a very brainwashed, warped mind to really, truly believe that the Israeli army, who has, not even an exaggeration, the highest moral standards for warfare, according to pretty much everybody who's not biased, The ratio of civilians to Hamas terrorists is unheard of in modern warfare. They have no intention of killing anybody accidentally or definitely not on purpose. And yet we're supposed to believe that they are going scorched earth, just murdering their own people when they're trying so hard not to murder Gazan people? It really makes no sense. And yet these people are saying it because it's an easy talking point. And the Hanibal Directive is an actual thing. So it has that little kernel of truth. And if you don't know what the Hanibal Directive is, or you look it up, it seems to check out. The reason that this came up now and why everybody is running with it is because the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, which by the way is an incredibly left paper, which can question its sources. I've heard some people who say it could be real, it might not be real, it might be an exaggeration. That Haaretz claims they have proof, according to military sources, that the Hanibal Directive was implemented, meaning the government said, hey guys, under any circumstances, we don't care. Do not let people take hostages. Get them back at all costs, even if it puts your own or their lives at risk. We need to make sure that people are not being taken as hostages. And why is this revisionist history important? This is very key because it takes us back to the first issue. If we believe that the Palestinian Arab terrorists who came in, people of Hamas, the civilians who came in to kidnap and sell those bodies to the Hamas terrorists, if they came in, we know what they did. We saw the rapes, we saw the killings, we saw everything. They videotaped it all. There was no question. But now with this Hanibal Directive, it allows all these apologists for Hamas to have a little bit of proof that, well, they made this Hanibal Directive thing, so therefore all of the people who got killed actually were killed by Israelis. And now let's go through all the footage and pictures because we just made up this Hanibal Directive thing, and let's see how we can revisionist history this into that day. Let's go find proof that we claim shows that Israel did this and that Hamas didn't kill anybody after all. They didn't kill anybody at the Nova Festival. That was all Israel, and so on and so on. It's just a way to remove the blame off of where it should be, where we all know it should be, where evidence is ample that it's on Hamas terrorists who filmed the entire thing. And yet we're trying to now change the story and revisionist history it, so it's the Israelis' fault on why everyone died on October 7th. And one thing that really stuck out to me, which I thought was really funny every time someone brings this topic up, is they love to talk about how Israel implements this horrible, barbaric Hanibal Directive that tells you can accidentally kill your own person in order to try and save them. And you can risk 10 soldiers' lives to maybe not even save one who might go into captivity. But what they leave out of this is the fact that why does Israel even need to have this in the first place? Nobody's asking that. Nobody's talking about, oh, that really sucks that Israel has to have a directive because they know that when their people are kidnapped, which is a form of terrorism that these people use, that they will be killed and that they will be tortured and raped. And Israel had to create this in order to hope to never have a soldier or a civilian taken because that is something that they do on their side. But nobody's talking about that. It is not important, the fact that Arab armies and Arab terrorists are using these tactics. Not a problem. In the end, you could see how this revisionist history is pretty much all that these people on the other side of the argument have. They can tell you all of these things that happened in the past, or tell you they didn't happen in the past, in order to justify why everything ends up being Israel's fault. Israel kills its own people. The Jews showed up in the land and ended up causing all this destabilization, and they occupy and they kill and they torture and they exile and all these lies that they tell in order to justify the fact that they don't have justification for why the Arab terrorists and the Hamas terrorists and the Hezbollah terrorists are doing what they're doing. They need to justify it. They need to come up with an excuse, go into the past, find a time where we can blame it on the Jews, why this whole thing started. So that way, it's okay that Hezbollah fires hundreds of rockets at the north. It's okay that Hamas goes in and rapes and kills people because really they didn't do it. The Israelis did it. Sometimes it really is difficult to deal with their logic because none of it makes any sense. And every time you ask them these questions, like, for example, what about all these massacres that were happening in the land before 1948 that you say it's all peaceful? And then they'll jump to another topic or they'll tell you none of that's true or whatever it might be. because they really don't have an answer for that. This is sort of the foundations of their fake history that they create. There really is no good solution to this problem. I can tell you as a person who debates all the time against people online, people in person, typically facts matter. But to these people, it doesn't. So I wouldn't suggest any of you guys go out and debate online or in person with people who are so brainwashed with all these talking points. But at least this arms you with a little bit of the facts about the reality before 1948 and how to spot these attempts at revisionist history in order to justify everything that happens against the Jewish state. Hopefully this podcast armed you with a little bit of the facts that you can now use whenever you hear these very frequently used talking points. Consider the revisionist history that these people are using and try and, if you can and if it's safe, poke holes in it, because there are many holes in their arguments, all of which make zero sense once you dip below the surface and you ask even one or two questions to try and clarify, like I did with this person online. They get really angry, so be very careful. They don't like it when you point at their problems and their theories, and they'll get violent and angry and call you names, and then it devolves into personal attacks and certain things like that. So I don't suggest you go and do this. I think you need to be armed with a lot more facts to be comfortable to actually stand up to these people. Because really, we shouldn't allow revisionist history to go unchecked, because that's really all they have. This has been another episode of the Jewish Diaspora Report. Don't forget to check us out on social media at jdr.podcast and check out some of our other episodes on your favorite podcast source. We'll see you next week in Jerusalem.